Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Audra Cremines, and I am thrilled to be your host for this exciting session. Whether you are joining us from your office or from your home, we are delighted to have you here. Today's webinar is all about the FDA and heavy metals in baby food. We have an exceptional panel of speakers who will be sharing their insights and expertise on this subject, and I'm certain that you will find the next 45 to 60 minutes to be incredibly valuable. Throughout the session, we encourage you to participate by asking questions in the chat box. This is an excellent opportunity to learn, network, and grow your knowledge on this subject. Before we begin, I'd like to give a quick overview of our panel of experts. Bob, thank you for joining us. Would you take a moment and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Bob Durkin. I'm an attorney with Arnold Golden Gregory, AGG. I focus mostly in the food and drug space. I'm a pharmacist with a master's degree in molecular biology. Prior to coming to AGG, I was in federal government for 18 years, FDA for about 12. I was the deputy office director of the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs, and I was privileged enough to work with the Toxic Elements Working Group before leaving the agency.
Thank you, Bob. Emily, would you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. My name is Emily Bair. I'm a registered dietitian. I work at a large children's hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've worked in a variety of different specialties, from surgery to craniofacial anomalies, and currently with pediatric gastroenterology and hepatology. Very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Kayla, would you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I am Dr. Kayla Bridges. I am a neonatal and pediatric registered dietitian by trade. I completed my master's degree in nutritional biochemistry from West Virginia University, during which I provided some technical support for cadmium exposure study. I then went on to complete my Doctor of Clinical Nutrition from Rutgers University. After that, I spent about 12 years working in the neonatal intensive care unit in the Metro Detroit area at Ascension St. John's, as well as William Beaumont Hospital. And as disclosure, my current role is now the medical director of North America for Else Nutrition. To try and continue on my research and making a difference at a larger scale.
Thanks, Kayla. Jackie, please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jackie Bowen. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Label Project. In terms of my background, I had worked for the World Health Organization Collaborating Center, NSF International, working on food safety and water quality standards for 15 years. My undergraduate degree was in environmental biology with a master's degree in quality management and quality engineering, as well as public health management.
Thank you all so much for those introductions. I know you are ready to share your knowledge, and we're so excited to hear more about what each of you have to say. So without further ado, let's officially get started. Bob, let's begin with you. Can you tell us about the history of FDA, the requirements, and what we might expect going forward?
Sure, happy to. I think for perception or perspective, it's best to maybe look at this before the report from Congress and before Closer to Zero were announced. So as I mentioned, I was on the Toxic Elements Working Group. This was established at CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, the house that's at FDA that takes care of food and food safety. And it was established back in 2017. This was a group of folks from the center that had backgrounds that they could use to try to leverage off one of other and with regulated industry to address toxic elements in our food supply. It's broader, but it would also include heavy metals in things like baby food. So the topic when I was at FDA was very much on the radar and very much being dealt with by the Toxic Elements Working Group. And this group would coordinate samplings, targeted inspections, transparency with regulated industry to try to work with regulated industry, a clearinghouse for maybe analytical methods, toxicology, epidemiology, risk exposure, trying to understand consumer behavior and economic behavior about what consumers were buying, because the jigsaw puzzle of what you eat goes to make up your total dietary exposure. So it was complicated. And we also worked in risk communications. And heavy metals in foods eaten by kids, by the population in general, certainly by infants and babies, was very much on the radar of the Toxic Element Working Group. The report to Congress happened in February of 21, and then closer to zero was announced in April 8th, 2021. And, before the attention from closer to zero, before the attention from the report to Congress, for FDA to take an action, to take an enforcement or compliance action, it had to rely solely on the adulteration standard in 402, that something in the food supply contained something was there or added that presented a risk of illness or injury, an unreasonable risk of illness or injury. If you're going to go in front of a judge, if you're going to take somebody's property, take their baby food from them so they can't sell it, or if you're going to go to the judge for an injunction and say somebody can't avail themselves of the act to make a living until they do it right, you have to have evidence. You have to be able to stand up in front of that judge and articulate why that article, why that baby food that contains lead or cadmium or mercury, why is it adulterated? It's hard to do. There's math involved, there's science involved, it has to be based in data. And as folks are aware, heavy metal contamination, it's so broad, it's so elusive to really nail down. How much lead leads to a neuro issue? How much cadmium or mercury actually is a risk to health that you can articulate and show on paper and put in front of a judge? So that kind of tied FDA's hands as to where they could really be aggressive with regulated industry. Report to Congress happens. It becomes, everybody's aware of it now. Honestly, I think the report caused more harm than it did good. A lot of folks stopped feeding their babies very good baby food and tried to make their own baby food, which was probably a bad idea. They're not able to tell if the carrots they pull out of their own garden had lead or mercury or cadmium in them, but yet they think they're making a better baby food. It probably wasn't true. But anyway, what Closer to Zero did, what the report did, was it gave FDA a new tool. It gave FDA public opinion. Now FDA doesn't simply have to rely on making a case in front of a judge, a 402 case based on adulteration. Now FDA can use its bully pulpit, its communications, its public outreach to say that according to the data they have now, they've set a risk level, or they've set a reference level, and from that reference level, they've set an action level. And they say they can go talk to firms if they approach that action level. They can ask the firm to do things. That's because now it's in the public eye. That's now FDA is a new tool in their bag, a new club in their bag, a new tool in the drawer to try to help firms come into voluntary compliance. It's the report to Congress went out February 4th, and then FDA announced Closer to Zero April 8th. As an FDA insider, someone who's worked there, I can tell you that plan was not conceived, written, and cleared in a month and a half. It's just simply an articulation of a lot of the things that FDA was doing before the report, and now they have different momentum and different tools. So, that kind of just sums it up. FDA has been doing a lot of the things that they're doing now. They've always been doing them. It's just now there's more attention and they have more tools in the bag to try to exert their influence over regulated industry without actually having to send a warning letter or having to insist on a recall or looking for a judicial action.
Thank you, Bob, so much at that look about regulation and what it could bring. Emily, can you tell us about what the FDA is currently doing?
Me unmute myself there. Thanks so much, Rob. You gave a great background on, from an FDA insider. And I would agree after doing some further research on the congressional subcommittee reports that came out a couple years ago, potentially did a little bit more harm than good from the perspective of there was a lot of reaction rather than evaluation and action. As you mentioned, those congressional subcommittee reports, which were requested by the Economic and Consumer Policy Work Group, initially were requested in November of 2021, the first being published in February of 2021. And then the second being published in September of 2021. So pretty quick turnaround from request to publication. And these primarily were evaluations of the top 7 baby food manufacturers, including manufacturers such as those of Happy Family Organics, Beech Nut Nutrition, Gerber, Plum Organic, Parents' Choice, some very familiar companies that families were familiar with. I would mention that these were not the first public reports of this sort that have been made available to the public. There was a Consumer Reports report similar to this published in 2017, as well as the Healthy Babies Bright Futures report from 2019, which additionally provided some evidence of the prevalence of heavy metals in these products and just generally in our food environment, which didn't maybe necessarily have as much impact on the public as these most recent Consumer Reports seem to have. Following up from the Congressional Subcommittee reports, as Rob mentioned, we had the Closer to Zero Action Plan, which was published by the FDA, which sort of set a timeline for publishing these actionable limits for heavy metals in the space of infant and toddler foods, following a pretty systematic step-by-step process, which Rob briefly mentioned, but I'll go through it a little bit more in depth. First step being to evaluate the current scientific data and literature that is presently available. In doing some narrative literature review myself, identified a relatively few amount of studies that have specifically identified the presence of heavy metals. A lot of those studies lacking from being able to provide risk assessment based data rather than hazard risk assessment, so simply evaluating the presence of heavy metals, whereas looking at the actual impact overall on the body over a length of time, which would be your more intense evaluation. So those are few and far between and probably need to have some more robustity in that research. The second step from the FDA and their Closer to Zero plan for each heavy metal is to establish interim reference levels, or IRLs, which is something that we've already seen starting to be established. Most recently, there were IRLs released from the FDA for lead in foods intended for babies and young children. They specifically outlined reference levels for lead in apple juice, other fruit juices, root vegetables, dry cereals, and then what they sort of considered like mixed food products, such as things like fruits and vegetables other than root vegetables, mixtures of like meats and grain-based products. And those are outlined on the FDA's website if anybody would like to reference those. We chose not to put up tables, so I had a nice little table for you, but I won't share that. So that's sort of where the FDA is currently at, is kind of moving through this timeline. And next steps are going to be continuing to develop those kind of reference initial action levels, consulting with the stakeholders, and then finalizing those action levels and distributing those out to your companies, and hopefully holding them accountable to maintaining those standards. Okay.
Thank you, Emily. I just wanted to remind everybody who's here that if you do have any questions that come up, please just put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of our program. Kayla, some people believe that the FDA guidance was a response to a recent Bloomberg article. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So there was another article that came out actually in January of 2023 that went, and I don't know that the FDA, I think the FDA actions had already kind of been initiated at this point. But what Bloomberg did is they went and they had gone out to the store and looked at those congressional reports and gone out to the store and purchased different baby food products, Bloomberg Law, and tested them in a laboratory for lead, arsenic, cadmium. And this was nothing new. There had already been reports on these, as Emily mentioned, on some of these baby foods. But what they did in this article was then kind of align them to what are these proposed action levels for the closer to zero, and are these baby food manufacturers still are they making any moves or differences in the way they're producing these foods? Are there any differences in this interim period? Because change takes time. This closer to zero, I think Emily and Bob can speak a little bit more on that timeline than I can. It's not going to happen overnight. So what people want to know is, what can I do for my child today, besides being reactive and going and making your own baby food without knowing, what you're putting in there. Again, that's something I dealt with that hits close to home from my years in that NICU, with people making their homemade baby formula or baby foods, and using ingredients that were less regulated than the foods they would have been purchasing, and having no idea and having no way to test it at home. So what Bloomberg found was that a lot of these foods that they tested still had traceable amounts of arsenic, lead, cadmium in them that were above what these proposed action levels are, which are much more strict than what had been historically. Something that came to mind for me was looking at, coming from the clinical side over to working in industry, to see how you can make it when you're trying to make a difference on a larger level. Is okay, well, there are some brands on here that I know are also working from the industry side to take action, but they're still showing up and being flagged here in this Bloomberg article. And why is that? There are other programs that have been in place that can help consumers identify these things in the interim, because all these heavy metals, they are present naturally in the environment and where we grow our food. So you're not going to be able to completely get away from that, but we want to get to levels that are and consumption levels, cumulative consumption levels, that are going to be healthier for our children as they grow. And so even though some of these brands on here I know are taking action to make a large difference, some may more than others. There's we'll have Jackie, this will lead right into you with the Clean Label Project, is one of those certifications where they had taken a preliminary action for industry manufacturers to try and show that they're doing something to make a difference. And I know that's something the company I'm currently working for takes pride in doing, and trying to make our products safe for children to consume. But there were a few brands that popped up on there that caught my attention that I knew were working with the same programs. So it doesn't mean that those were perfect yet, but it does show that the FDA is taking action to try and get even more strict than what we can do in the interim here. So with that, I'll let you lead on to Jackie, who I hope can tell us a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Kayla. Yes, Jackie, you started the Clean Label Project to deal with exactly these types of issues that Kayla brings to light. Can you speak a little bit on that for us?
Sure. So Clean Label Project is a national nonprofit based here in Colorado with the mission to bring truth and transparency to consumer product labeling. Early on, one of the investigations that we did was looking at the levels of heavy metals in top selling baby foods and infant formulas. And the reality is that, just like we talked about, I mean, one of the whole impetus of the creation of Clean Label Project is this growing divide between the court of law and the court of public opinion on that definition of food and consumer product safety. So much of the attention in the US when it comes to food safety is focused on microbial and pathogen contaminants, things that can contribute to vomiting, diarrhea, or worse within 24 to 72 hours. But what we see is that consumers, media, academic and legal attention is increasingly being paid to how is the food we eat, the food we eat, the consumer products we use have, an exposure to low levels of industrial environmental contaminants like heavy metals, pesticide residues, plasticizers. How does it play into chronic disease, things like cancer, infertility? And the kicker is that consumers would never find this information on a product label. And for the most part, within people in food manufacturing, you would never find it within a CGMP or an SQF or a HACCP program. So for us, it was a matter of bridging the gap between what is it consumers are thinking about, especially in these highly emotive categories that are focused on like infant and maternal health. Clean Label Project partnered with the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine to take that data on the levels of heavy metals, pesticides, and plastics, and ultimately publish on heavy metals. In terms of kind of what I see taking place is that, the reality is that heavy metals are naturally occurring in the Earth's crust. They're right up there on that periodic table of elements that we all saw in middle school, right up there next to oxygen and hydrogen. You've got arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. So having nothing and non-detect is unrealistic because they are naturally occurring. However, because of human causes like mining, fracking, industrial agriculture, the use of wastewater for irrigation, there are pollution hotspots. And depending on the proximity of where those crops are harvested and where they're being used, they have the potential to end up in finished products that are marketed towards these vulnerable populations. In the absence of federal guidelines requiring brands to test for these types of things, they will unintentionally be introduced into the supply chain, unless in the interim, brands voluntarily decide to think about food safety differently. So along those lines, it's one where what we see at Clean Label Project is there absolutely are ways that you can adapt. For anyone that's in kind of like food manufacturing, you can absolutely adapt your supply chain, look for lower risk heavy metals, or I'm sorry, lower risk ingredients that have just happen to not, absorb as many heavy metals. It's a matter of making sure that for those that have kiddos at home, making sure you diversify their diet. But the reality is that right now we've got FDA providing guidance over the, interim, tolerance limit for lead. And if we only had lead to worry about, that would be one thing. But it's not just lead. It's lead and cadmium and pesticide residues and packaging migration issues. The other reality is that it's for Clean Label Project, we're of course always going to be in favor of continuous improvement and reducing, heavy metal exposure. But the other reality we've got to think about when it comes to feeding our kids is that we want more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. We don't want to incentivize poor nutritional density. We don't want to incentivize the use of synthetics or using water in order to, bring down any of the risk of heavy metals. We want our children to be satiated and nourished during that critical first 1,000 days of development. So along those lines, what we're looking at is that, this is one step in the right direction, but we've still got a long way to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackie. We are going to now take some questions that we've received during the panel, some in the public chat and some in the private chat. So I will go ahead and start with the first one. We have a question. Is pureeing fruits and vegetables worse than buying actual baby food when it comes to these heavy metals? Jackie, that's for you.
Sure, I can address that. So it was interesting. There actually was a study that I think Happy Baby Bright Futures several months back released a study looking at it. I was like, hey, if you buy fresh fruits and veg, how does it differ? The reality is it doesn't, both in terms of their study as well as when you think about it in terms of the crux of it. It's one where in the absence or the limited guidance that's provided by industry, it's like those same fruits and vegetables in the produce departments are the ones being utilized in the baby food that's being made. What needs to happen from a for me, both as like from an engineering perspective as mom, as well as a public health advocate, is that what I like and what, kind of restores my faith and what I'm optimistic about is the fact that we're starting to see guidance around heavy metals. What I don't see yet is the reality that high quality, nutritious baby foods come from high quality, nutritious ingredients. High quality, nutritious ingredients come from high quality, nutritious soils. Healthy soils come from good environmental policy. And I have yet to see steps 1, 2, and 3 take place so that we have a reproducibly compliant and very healthy finished product baby food system. What I do see taking place potentially, and Clean Label Project just posted this as part of our comments to the FDA in light of this recent lead guidance, is that, because we don't have these other steps, 1, 2, and 3 in place, in Europe, they've had a regulation called Contaminants and Foodstuff Standard that has been around for nearly 30 years. European suppliers are looking at this as, okay, this is a great opportunity for us. And it is. These are going to be healthy, nutritious ingredients. And unfortunately, they will supply it to it will be supplied to the American market, and American babies will be fed, unfortunately, at the expense potentially of American farmers. The thing is, we've got to put the systems in place to make sure we have healthy soils, so we have healthy ingredients, so we create healthy, nutritious baby foods.
To piggyback on that, Jackie, it's not necessarily that pureeing your own fruits and vegetables are worse than buying actual baby food. It's doing your homework and finding where you're sourcing them from, getting a variety and rotating in so you're not getting a cumulative effect of one single ingredient from one single source. And again, that's where I was going with, doing more harm than good. If parents that aren't doing their homework, or they think they're doing homework, and they're, I had, for instance, I was in my NICU days, I had a pediatrician reach out to me because a family came up to them and we're using all sorts of ingredients like red yeast and this and that to make their own homemade baby formula. And when I did the nutritional analysis of it, I mean, they were throwing in arsenic and lead exposure, and I think lithium and a few other things, and some very unbalanced micronutrients as well. So it's as a parent, you want to make sure that you are getting that balance in for your child. If you're going to go that route, you are reaching out to the healthcare professionals and your food scientists and environmental professionals to see where you can best source things and incorporate that variety in.
That is such a good point. And one other thing I'll add to that, I think one thing you absolutely can control at the home, so many people don't pay attention to it, is have your water tested. There are so many, depending on where you live, there are the infrastructure under especially cities or homes that happen to be older can be made of lead pipes. And you look at when you're making baby food, mixing it with formula, right? Because you take the water, you mix it with things like formula, you've got the cumulative effect. Have your water tested, figure out if it's coming from a lead pipe, because that could be a really quick, easy, natural fit of adding a filter in order to minimize lead introduction through your water.
I see in there, Jackie, too, about if we go around vegetables, how do they know if they're better off or worse? And again, you can usually check with your city's water department to see any water warnings. I know that you've got a few resources too. That's something I would always preach when I was educating in the NICU, especially when they're using water to mix formula or foods for their primary source for their kids. You want to make sure that that's safe. Jackie, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, the other reality is that when it comes to food, like it's also one where, I'm here in Colorado, of which I can say I can successfully grow tomatoes and pumpkins in my yard, but nothing else. So along those lines, it's at least one where what I can control for is I know that I'm not adding, pesticides or anything like that. So it's sometimes where a little bit more about the origins of where your product is coming from. It's also one where, because you're controlling for some of those origins and soil in your backyard, it also, it's not just even that soils, once they're, have been undergoing or been through a lot of that industrial agriculture, it also depletes kind of like the nutrients from the soil too. So I think kind of growing, this is my, personal opinion, but I think growing your own fruits and vegetables is a fun, interesting, novel way to both learn the process, know where your food is coming from, as well as grow some really healthy food.
I see one in there. Is it common practice for companies to share their heavy metal test results with consumers? I will say this from being on both the clinical side and the industry side. As a clinician, it would always concern me if I reached out to the medical affairs department directly of a company and they wouldn't share information with me. That would always be a red flag. Some companies may, some companies may not. A lot of companies probably won't post that directly on their websites. Other companies will go through the process with companies such as, the Clean Label Project, or organizations such as the Clean Label Project, to be more transparent about what's in their products. So kind of use that as guidance. Emily, Jackie, Bob, do you guys have anything to add to that one?
I'll add my own 2 cents to it of like, I see some, well, I guess I'll say it's a couple things. I see some companies sharing their test results, and how a brand approaches transparency is completely up to them. The unfortunate reality is sometimes when data is shared, a few things. One, it can be unfortunately weaponized. I'm like, oh my gosh, did you see that there's 4 parts per billion of arsenic? It's one where I look at it as like, that's actually really low. That's great. But it's one where depending on how that information is used and received, that type of thing, it can cause concern. But it's also, I'm like a huge fan of transparency and, consumers and being able to use the information, figure out what's best for their fit for their family. But along those lines, for consumers, especially for products that your kiddo loves, it's one where, at Clean Label Project, we test for things like heavy metals, pesticide residues, and plasticizers. If your kiddo has a product that you love, that their brand isn't certified, or you just want to know more details, reach out to the brand. More specifically, reach out to the brand over social media so you can ask questions, demand answers, even in a public forum, which is even more fun. Because then it's one where, if this is a staple of your pantry, then just do your homework. So often, especially now, moms are the chief operating officer of the household. And so embrace that role and kind of just do your homework so you too can feel confident about what you're putting on the kitchen table.
Yeah. I think it brings up a really good perspective that we've been dancing around, that, the FDA's program is called Closer to Zero, not we're going to achieve zero. And theoretically, could we achieve zero for heavy metals in our baby food? Probably. I mean, the technology is amazing. It probably could happen. But at what cost? At what expense? Where else could that money and that effort and that energy be going to? I mean, there comes a point where, just like you said, if you saw a COA that said 4 parts per million, I forget which example you use, cadmium, or it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's not a risk. It's not an adulteration. It's not going to hurt your baby as long as they're eating a balanced diet. But if folks insist that we really do drive these numbers to zero, what's that cost going to be? What else are we not going to be taking care of that we could in our system of providing food to people? Rather than, technology or development into more nutritious crops, or a crop that you can turn over 3 times a year instead of 2, where you can feed more people, more healthy food, eat more easily. Everything comes at a cost. So there comes a point where we're going to get to heavy metal contamination where it's okay where it's at. It's good where it's at. There's so many other things to be looking at. We've heard pesticides, plasticizers, good agricultural practices. There's so many other things that have to be considered, that as long as people don't just focus on the number 0 when it comes to heavy metals, I think we'll be much better off.
I'll give an example too. I know I busted this out in an email once when I was looking at that Bloomberg article, but I think one of the things that were on there was a company that I know, has been taking similar actions that the company I work for does in trying to be transparent about their levels, but they still had, a certain amount of lead in their beet puff, I believe it was. And when you did the math, it worked out to, 0.014 grams times 11.4 parts per billion equals 0.1 mics per serving, well under the 2.2 mics per day limit, but still way above that desired threshold that the FDA Closer to Zero program is trying to reach. So we should be, we should be glad that as consumers that the FDA is moving in that direction, because that alone is bringing to light. But just to give you an example of how far we've come from where they started.
Yeah. I wonder if that's
another question.
I was going to say, I wonder if that's an example of a company where under, Closer to Zero, FDA is trying to do more outreach And, one of the things they said that they would do when a firm approaches an interim action level is talk to the firm, work with the firm to figure out why, and maybe see if there isn't some best practices or some information they can share. If everyone else that's serving that same type of commodity with those same ingredients is twofold, threefold lower, you might not technically be adulterated, but there's something you could be doing better to put a better product on the market.
Jackie, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, but that's something that came to my mind in reading that article too, is how the Clean Label Project has their methodology and benchmarking different brands, that some of these brands are still, among the top in their category, but they're not perfect yet. And then, the FDA is obviously changing their guidance right now and their regulation. Oh, you're on mute.
In terms of Clean Label Project and some of those best practices, like you talked about, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one where when it comes to Clean Label Project methodology, we have a certification, sure, but it's one where some of those basic requirements is that as part of when you go about creating a formulation, when you go about sourcing ingredients, it's a matter of voluntarily thinking about your ingredient specifications differently. It's always a matter of you're looking at it that you want the Brix, which is the sugar profile, the taste to be within a certain amount, the vitamin A, different specifications. But it's also one where you can put specifications in there of like, I want a heavy metal test conducted, and I want it to be below this threshold. The thing is, sometimes people hear about like, whoa, so you're testing for like arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury, and, down to single digit parts per billion. And the reality is sometimes, either people in industry or even consumers will think of like, wow, that sounds really expensive. The reality is to test for heavy metal panel is $160.
Yeah.
$160. And we can know what level of these heavy metals are in any given ingredient. So it's a matter of doing that upfront due diligence before you source the ingredient in order to kind of figure out, is this the best fit for my whatever the product that I happen to be making. So it's just a matter of, I think, the reality of where we're at now is that a lot of brands have their supply chains and their formulations, pretty buttoned up. So it's a matter of kind of going back, rethinking that in light of some of these new risks as well as these new regulations, and figure out, right, how do we go forward in light of this new expectation. But along those lines, in terms of Clean Label Project and our methodology, you're absolutely right. It's a matter of you rethinking the way you do your supplier assurance programs. It's having a risk-based testing program. It's about, testing should be confirmation of a ready, productive, and effective quality assurance system is the way it should work.
Yeah. You shouldn't be testing quality in. Quality should be built in. Absolutely.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
We have another question in terms of heavy metals, sustainability, and baby growth. Can one of you explain the difference between plant-based milk products and dairy milk products, and how that might have, affect how do we differentiate the two when it comes to heavy metal, sustainability, and baby growth?
I can speak a little bit on plant-based versus milk, but I can't speak to the baby growth bit. Maybe Kayla, you can speak to that one. I guess from my perspective, in testing both plant-based as well as like regular dairy-based product, the reality is that, the way that works is that the kidneys and the liver are a beautiful thing, and their whole kind of purpose is to remove this stuff. It's not like we have an unfiltered system that it passes through. The reality, though, is when it comes to plants, is what's in the soil is going to be absorbed. And so along those lines, you do see that certain plants are just inherently better at sucking up heavy metals. For example, soy is of elevated risk of heavy metal absorption. We see rice as another one where you see rice as a sweetener in a variety of different products, and rice is inherently elevated when it comes to arsenic. Another one that is notorious for increased heavy metals is, and it's a hot ingredient, is hemp, CBD. Along those lines, you don't really see it obviously in baby food, but it's a natural heavy metal bioaccumulator. It is a garbage collector in the soil that is planted in military installations to clean it up. So along those lines, it's a matter of plants don't necessarily have that same filtration system. So you do see certain plants have elevated amounts of heavy metals as opposed to dairy, which goes through this more of a filtration process.
We'll speak a little bit on the growth, and maybe Emily, if there's anything you want to piggyback on, but babies have very delicate metabolisms. You need a balance of certain micronutrients to stimulate growth. A deficit in one could completely stunt growth. We would see that all the time in the neonatal intensive care unit, especially when we had vitamin shortages, IV vitamin shortages, where you could just be deficient in one thing and it could cause a whole chain reaction downstream and impair growth, let alone like neurodevelopment and other organ function. But there's also in terms of digestion absorption, you have certain types of elements that could collect into bone, and you can have instead of your calcium and phosphorus that you're worried about, if you have different metals in your IVs, so that can leach into bone growth and contaminate, or you could have a certain metal that might inhibit the absorption of another like nutritious metal, like or substance like zinc, copper, manganese, all of these things. And Emily, you can kind of speak more into later into the infancy and childhood. Do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, muting myself. No, I agree with everything you said, Kayla. We definitely want a strong start. Having adequate nutrition during early infancy is definitely important for later childhood and adolescence, from things like skeletal growth. It can be really difficult. We miss those opportunities for adequate linear growth later on. There's a window of catch up that we have. So if you've got heavy metals that are limiting bone growth, that can definitely be a major concern. From a plant-based diet perspective, I don't have any concerns for adequate nutrition and it related to growth, as long as we ensure there's a balanced diet from amino acids, for example. That is something that we consider more on plant-based diets, is ensuring adequate amino acid intake and fatty acid intake. But it's not really much of a concern at this point. We've got a lot of really balanced plant-based options out there nowadays.
Is fluoride considered a heavy metal?
I don't know off the top of my head if it's considered a heavy metal. I don't think it is, but that's a good opportunity to broaden the scope of what we're talking about. We're not just talking about heavy metals necessarily, but toxic elements, things that, that's a great example of another hazard that might creep into our food supply if we're just looking at heavy metals alone. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure if fluoride is classified or as a heavy metal, but knowing its chemistry, I could see where fluoride could be an adulterant in a food. It could cause problems.
You need fluoride. We've had kids that had their first birthday in the NICU where I had to go and have my volunteers help me get fluoridated water into the NICU because, we're using these sterile formulations in this delicate environment. They're not getting enough fluoride by their first birthday, but it's such a minor balance that if you have too much, then you can have, tooth decay and other problems.
Yeah. Wikipedia tells me that fluoride is not technically a heavy metal, but I don't know.
As the FDA gets more involved, could we see labels that need to disclose levels of heavy metals?
It would require a regulation, or maybe what appears on food labels is heavily regulated. There's certain information that has to be there, and there are certain parts of the label of a food or a dietary supplement that only that information can be there. There's not a foreclosure or where you're not allowed to put additional information on the label. It can't be false or misleading. As you put information on the label of your products, be aware of not only the Food and Drug Administration's requirements under 21 CFR 101 or 403, but you also have this little organization called the Federal Trade Commission that has some pretty sharp teeth when it comes to labeling, advertising. I don't know that I see a day when it's going to be required, but it's an interesting question.
How do the stats? Do you have a?
I was just going to comment. I was recently in California And California has some pretty strict,
Yeah.
not necessarily specifically food labeling, but just environmental exposure labeling rules. And so they're, on store shelves. If you have a ceramic mug that was made with a product that could have a toxic element to it, they label that. It was very obvious the products at the zoo gift store that were not being purchased because they had this label in front of it, versus those that did not have a toxic label in front of it. So that's sort of an interesting, just, something that we are seeing locally, that I think may not necessarily trickle down to food products, but from a outside of heavy metal in food, but toxic elements in other areas in our environment might be something that we see.
We have a question about the standards of the FDA. How do the standards of the FDA and the Clean Label Project compare to worldwide standards for heavy metals?
You want to go first?
I guess the one thing I'll say on there, and it kind of addresses another question that comes up later for proposed limits for FDA as well as Prop 65. So it's an interesting nuance, and actually, I'd actually love your comments on this one too. Is that with California Prop 65, they do a tolerance based on serving size. So it's one where, because it's based on serving size, it's one where just because like a blanket 10 parts per billion is like, well, what's the size of it? If it's this big versus like if it's this big, what does that mean? It almost has to be put into how it's used, how it's consumed, what is the size, the weight in grams. So along those lines, I look at as Clean Label Project, the way that we do ours is relevant. We compare things compared to the category. So if it was something where it was a pouch, generally pouches are around 100 grams each. And so they're kind of being compared to one another. The thing is, with the new limits of FDA, it makes it tricky because it's straight across the board, 10 parts per billion, that type of thing. From my perspective, looking at it like how California does, where you standardize, where you look at the serving size of what's declared on a product label. So compliance is evaluated on the individual product basis. I personally find more helpful and probably, easier for a brand to say, what exactly, am I compliant? Yes or no, because my serving size is this. But I'd love your thoughts on that too.
That's exactly what I alluded to earlier when I said that FDA has to be able to prove that a product's adulterated. And it's based off of the way that you would consume that product. Either it's standard use or it's labeled use. It's called exposure. What's a person's exposure to that toxic element on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, lifetime basis? And FDA has to be able to, when push comes to shove, go in front of an impartial arbiter or judge and say, this is why we had to take that product off the market. Now, when you compare it to other standards, FDA just has to be able to show that there's a basis in science and data that the product presents the risk that FDA thinks it does. When I was at FDA, they'd be very happy to pull an EPA standard off the shelf or a Prop 65 standard off the shelf or a standard that's used in Germany. As long as the logic, the data, and the math was there for an FDA toxicologist to agree, the medical doctors to agree, I think this is right. I think this articulates adulteration. FDA could take that standard right off the shelf and use it. When people use arbitrary numbers, though, like if a Prop 65 or some other jurisdiction were to throw an arbitrary number out there, that's useless to FDA. There has to be the science and the data to back it up. But that's exactly how FDA does it. It's based on exposure. So it's sort of, a certain exposure to lead would be an adulterant to an infant, but not to one of us. A certain exposure to lead would probably be an adulterant to one of you, but not me because I have a larger body mass. And that's exactly how it's calculated at FDA. And there have been instances in the past where a product that had different directions for use was adulterated under one direction of use, but not adulterated under its other direction of use because of the differences in exposure and the differences of the population, the demographic that was going to eat it.
Guys, we have about 12 minutes left in our webinar, so I don't think we have any more questions to cover live. So I'd like to offer each one of you a chance to give any final comments about any of the issues raised here today, or any thoughts that we can take away with us. Bob, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, I think people have to understand that the Food and Drug Administration ensures probably the safest food supply in the world. It's built off of voluntary compliance. There's no way that FDA or any country's regulatory authority could, actively ensure compliance. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is based off of voluntary compliance, and voluntary compliance is encouraged that when you catch a bad person, when you catch a bad actor, you punish them significantly. You make an example out of them. So I just, we all kind of hit on it. That report to Congress was probably caused some harm or some risk, but at least it gave FDA the attention to an issue that it had been trying to work on for years. And it's given it another tool. It's given it public opinion. Whether an interim action level is something that FDA could go to court with, I'm not sure. Like I said, it has to be based in science and math. But what FDA can do now is make that phone call and talk to that company whose product exceeds that interim action level, make sure they're aware of it, ask them why it's happening. And if it's significant enough, they could say, maybe you should recall. Oh, you're not going to recall? Well, I'm going to have to do a press release, and shucks, I'm going to have to tell them what you did. And they get to use their bully pulpit now. They get to use their public messaging to try to help companies want to do the right thing. So I think if at the end of the day, we've just put FDA in a position where they're more capable to do what they've always wanted to do. I think it would be wrong if Congress were to step in and set arbitrary limits for heavy metals or any adulterant. I think you have to leave that to the scientists, to the regulatory agency that's driven by science. I think that's FDA's purview. But at the end of the day, I think parents trying to feed their babies and babies are in a better position now than they were 4 years ago, 3 years ago.
Emily, why don't you go next? Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of piggyback off of what Robert just said. That the FDA kind of has their place, and the parents have their place, and the medical professionals also have a place in this. Something I was thinking about throughout this is, this is a great PSA for actually talk to your pediatricians, actually request to get in touch with a dietitian. We're here to help explain, research. We'll do all of that, reading of the literature for you and explain it in a way that will help guide you in making these decisions in a actionary rather than a reactionary method. I have families come to me all the time with, seemingly simple questions like this, like, should I choose that product or should I choose that product? And we're able to sit down and answer the questions and evaluate their concerns about those products. So I would just encourage, if anybody's on here that is a provider, utilize your additional allied care providers like dietitians. If you're a parent and you have children, request referrals to those allied providers. And if you're not, tell your friends and family. Utilize our knowledge and resources in making decisions around this space.
Kayla?
Emily, I couldn't have said it much better. That's, it's very easy for parents to go out there and Google answers. Use your resources. Scientists are scientists because they want to be out there doing the research and doing good things for the most part. And, a healthcare team, it's just that. It's a team of professionals. One person may have a niche expertise in one area of that, but when we put all of our heads together and, talk to our patients and try and figure out what those individuals' needs are, and what's important to that family. That was one thing I would always emphasize in my clinical practice is sitting down, listening. Well, what are you looking for and why is this important to you? And then connecting with the rest of the team. But, it's easy to go and find anything on the internet these days, but, you want to be referring to a clinician or scientist who knows how to read those studies and interpret them back to you and tell them what the relevance is, and the clinical application of it, because that it's not all the same, and we work together as professionals to make that happen. And so, if you're looking for that, either as another provider or as a parent, do your homework, use your resources, find your other professionals who are educated and experts in those areas, and use it to your advantage. Reach out, don't, go down the rabbit hole yourself, and try to figure it all out on your own. Those people are there for a reason.
Jackie.
I would say for brands, I would say the reality is that compliance with federal law, that's table stakes. It's the minimum you need to do to legally sell product. No one's going to congratulate you for not necessitating a recall today. But compliance with the court of public opinion, that's the true north. That's where you kind of grow the consumer loyalty, the willingness to pay, grow market share, win with consumers as well as retailers. View your true north as kind of what you're looking to achieve in terms of helping your brand win. Compliance with, regulatory statute, that's the minimum. So, but from a consumer perspective, I would say for consumers, view your dollars as a vote for the food systems you believe in. Look at your dollars to be kind of to represent the change that you want to see in the world, and vote accordingly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Bob, Emily, Kayla, and Jackie, we can't thank you enough for joining us and discussing this very important topic of heavy metal levels in our babies and children's food. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us as well. I just wanted to say that in a few days, you'll get a recording or an email link with a recording to the session. And this panel was arranged and sponsored by Else Nutrition, the leading plant-based nutrition solution for toddlers and kids. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you learned something and enjoyed today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.